Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crawled out from under the main power distributor on Kepler Station. 3 years of working alongside the Zephyrians had taught him that their idea of perfection and his idea of practical were two very different things. The tall crystalline beings moved through the station corridors like living glass sculptures, their bodies reflecting the blue light that ran through every surface of their technology. They spoke in musical tones that his translator barely managed to convert into understandable words. The station hung in the void between two star systems, serving as a crucial stop for ships traveling the outer trade routes. It was massive, easily, the size of a small city with docking bays that could handle everything from tiny courier ships to enormous cargo haulers. The Zephyrians had built it as a joint project with humanity, though Jake often felt more like a tolerated guest than an equal partner. He pulled his toolkit from the maintenance panel and stood up, his knees creaking after hours of cramped work. The artificial gravity felt lighter than Earth normal, which the Zephyrians preferred. Everything about the station was designed for their comfort and their way of thinking. Clean lines, perfect angles, and systems that worked flawlessly as long as nothing unexpected happened. The problem was that in space, unexpected things happened all the time. Morrison, came the melodic voice of Veltar, the Zephyrian chief. Engineer. The alien approached with that strange gliding walk they all had, as if their feet barely touched the ground. The power fluctuations in Sector 7 continue. Jake nodded and picked up his portable scanner. I know. The problem is, in the junction box 3 levels down, the connection points are corroding because your alloy doesn't handle the humidity from the human quarters very well. I keep telling the Council we need to replace those connectors with something more resistant. Veltar's crystalline features shifted, and what Jake had learned was their version of disapproval. The design is perfect. Human modifications are the source of instability. This was the same argument they had been having for months. Every time something went wrong, the Zephyrians blamed human interference with their perfect systems. Every time Jake fixed a problem, they acted like he had somehow caused it in the first place. He had started keeping detailed logs of every repair, every improvement, every suggestion that was ignored. The power fluctuation alarms started ringing again, echoing through the corridors with their annoying high-pitched whine. Jake grabbed his emergency kit and headed for the lift. I'll go fix it again, he said. But Veltar had already glided away. The trip down to the lower engineering levels took 15 minutes. The lift moved slowly by human standards, another Zephyrian preference. Jake used the time to review the schematics on his tablet. The power distribution system was elegant, he had to admit that. The Zephyrians could build beautiful technology. But beautiful and practical were not always the same thing. When the lift doors opened, Jake immediately heard the crackling sound that meant electrical arcing. The smell of burning insulation filled the air. He hurried down the corridor toward the junction box, already knowing what he would find. The same corroded connections, the same design flaw that he had identified and reported 6 months ago. He opened the panel and saw exactly what he expected. The elegant crystalline connectors were blackened and pitted, where moisture had gotten into the sealed compartment. The Zephyrians had built the station assuming that their environmental systems would maintain perfect conditions everywhere. They had not accounted for human crew members who needed higher humidity in their quarters, or for the inevitable small leaks that developed in any large structure. Jake began the careful process of cleaning and replacing the damaged connectors. It was tedious work that required shutting down power to several sections of the station. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, while his mind wandered to the bigger picture. This was the 4th time this month he had fixed this exact same problem. 4 times he had submitted reports explaining the root cause and recommending permanent solutions. 4 times the Zephyrian Council had dismissed his suggestions as unnecessary modifications to their perfect design. 2 hours later, Jake finished the repair and restored power to the affected sections. The fluctuation alarms stopped ringing, and the normal hum of the station's systems returned. He cleaned his tools and packed up his equipment, then headed back to the upper levels to file another report that would probably be ignored. The main engineering bay was empty when he arrived. That was unusual. Normally, at least a few Zephyrian technicians were monitoring the various systems, but today the gleaming consoles stood unattended. Jake checked the shift schedule on his tablet and frowned. According to the roster, there should be a full crew on duty. He walked to the central command station and pulled up the system status displays. Everything showed green except for some minor issues in the outer ring sections. Nothing that required immediate attention. Maybe the Zephyrians were having one of their meditation periods. They did that sometimes, gathering in their crystal chambers to do whatever it was that crystalline aliens did when they needed to think. Jake was about to leave when he noticed something odd. The docking bay indicators showed that several ships had departed in the last few hours. That was not unusual by itself, but the departure pattern was strange. The ships had left in rapid succession, not the normal staggered schedule that allowed for proper traffic control. He pulled up the communications log and felt his stomach drop. The last few entries were brief departure requests, all approved immediately by Veltar. Emergency departures, the kind that skipped normal checkout procedures. Jake scrolled through the messages, his growing alarm turning into cold dread as he realized what was happening. The Zephyrians were evacuating the station. Jake ran to the nearest observation deck and pressed his face against the transparent aluminum window. In the distance, he could see the distinctive glowing trails of several ships moving away from the station at high speed. As he watched, another ship undocked from the far side of the station and accelerated into the darkness. He raced back to the command center and checked the crew roster. According to the computer, there were still 47 Zephyrians on board, but Jake had a sick feeling that the computer was wrong. He activated the internal communication system and called for Veltar. No response. He tried the council chambers, the meditation areas, even the private quarters. Nothing. The truth hit him like a physical blow. They had left him behind. The Zephyrians had evacuated their perfect station and abandoned the human engineer who had spent 3 years keeping their beautiful but flawed systems running. He stood alone in the command center, surrounded by softly glowing displays that showed a fully operational station, while outside his window, the last of the evacuation, ships disappeared into the starfield. Jake Morrison was alone on Kepler Station, and he had no idea why. Jake stood in the empty command center for several minutes trying to process what had happened. The soft humming of the station's systems continued around him, but the silence felt wrong. Kepler Station had never been quiet like this. There had always been the musical voices of the Zephyrians, the sound of footsteps in the corridors, the background chatter of normal operations. He forced himself to move and walked to the main communications console. His fingers flew over the controls as he tried to contact any of the departed ships. Static filled his earpiece. He adjusted frequencies, boosted the signal strength, and tried emergency channels. Nothing. Either the ships were already too far away, or they were deliberately ignoring his calls. Jake pulled up the station's internal sensors and began a systematic check of every section. The crew quarters showed empty. The work areas showed empty. Even the meditation chambers where the Zephyrians spent hours in their strange crystalline trances were vacant. The computer still listed 47 Zephyrians as being on board, but Jake knew the sensors were not designed to track individual aliens. They relied on ID badges and manual check-ins, both of which could be faked or forgotten. He tried accessing the departure logs to understand why they had left so suddenly. Most of the files were encrypted with Zephyrian security codes that he did not have access to. The few messages he could read mentioned something about catastrophic system failure, imminent and human contamination of core systems. Jake felt his anger rising. After 3 years of fixing their problems, they were still blaming him for the station's issues. The anger helped him focus. Jake made his way to the central computer core and began pulling up diagnostic reports. Tfo. There was really a catastrophic failure coming. He needed to know about it. The main systems all showed normal operation. Power distribution was stable after his repair work. Life support was running efficiently. Environmental controls were maintaining proper atmosphere throughout the station. Then he found it buried in a subsection of the engineering reports. A projection model created by the Zephyrian engineers 3 days ago. According to their calculations, the station's main power core would experience a cascade failure within the next week. The failure would result in a complete loss of power, followed by structural collapse as the magnetic field generator shut down. The station would tear itself apart. Jake stared at the report, reading through the technical details. The Zephyrian engineers had based their projection on the assumption that the power fluctuations he had been fixing were symptoms of a deeper problem. They believed that human modifications to their systems had created instabilities that would eventually cause the entire power grid to collapse. But Jake could see the flaws in their reasoning immediately. They had not accounted for his recent repairs. They had not considered the actual cause of the fluctuations. Most importantly, they had used theoretical models instead of real-world testing. The Zephyrians were brilliant engineers, but they thought in terms of perfect mathematics rather than messy reality. Jake spent the next 2 hours running his own diagnostics on every system connected to the power core. What he found confirmed his suspicions. The power grid was stable. The fluctuations had been caused by the corroded connectors he kept replacing, not by fundamental design flaws. The Zephyrians had panicked and evacuated based on a computer model. That was simply wrong. The realization that he was alone because of a mistake should have made him feel better, but it did not. Jake was still stranded on a massive space station with no way to communicate with the outside galaxy. The nearest inhabited system was 4 months away by the fastest ship, and he had no ship. The Zephyrians had taken all the escape pods with them when they evacuated. Jake forced himself to think practically. First priority was life support. The station's atmosphere processors were designed to handle a crew of 60 beings for several years without resupply. With only one human on board, the air and water would last much longer. Food was a bigger problem. The Zephyrians ate crystalline nutrients that would probably kill him, but there were emergency rations in the human quarters that would last about 3 months if he was careful. Second priority was communication. The main transmitter array had enough power to reach neighboring systems, but it required manual alignment that was normally done by a full crew. Jake would have to figure out how to operate it himself. Third priority was transportation. There had to be some kind of small craft left on the station. The Zephyrians used maintenance pods for external repairs that might be capable of short-range flight. Jake started with the immediate needs. He went to his quarters and gathered all the emergency food supplies he could find. The packages were designed to provide complete nutrition for humans. Though they tasted like cardboard mixed with vitamins, he carried them to the command center so he could eat while monitoring the station's systems. Next, he tackled the life support optimization. The atmospheric processors were running at full capacity for a crew of 60. Jake reprogrammed them to maintain atmosphere in only the essential sections of the station. The command center, his quarters, the main engineering bay, and the corridors connecting them. He shut down life support to the Zephyrian quarters, the meditation chambers, and most of the outer ring sections. This would extend his air supply indefinitely and reduce the load on the power systems. The water recycling system needed similar adjustment. Jake modified the processing parameters to handle waste from one human instead of 60 mixed-species crew members. The Zephyrians had very different biological needs, and their waste recycling required complex crystalline filters that were expensive to maintain. By switching to human-only parameters, Jake could simplify the entire system and make it more reliable. While the life support modifications were processing, Jake turned his attention to the communication array. The manual was written in Zephyrian mathematical notation that took him several hours to decode. The alignment procedure required precise positioning of 3 separate transmitter dishes, coordinated timing of signal bursts, and compensation for the station's orbital movement. It was designed to be done by a team of specialists, not a single human engineer working alone. Jake spent the rest of the day studying the communication system and running simulations on his portable computer. The math was complex but not impossible. He would need to move between 3 different control stations, making precise adjustments within narrow time windows. One mistake would require starting the entire sequence over again. As the station's artificial day cycle moved toward evening, Jake realized how quiet everything had become. He had turned off life support to most sections, which eliminated the background noise of air circulation and temperature control. The only sounds were the soft humming of essential systems and his own breathing. He had never experienced such complete isolation. Jake made himself dinner from one of the emergency ration packs and sat in the command center, watching the stars wheel slowly past the observation windows. Earth was somewhere out there, but it might as well have been in another galaxy. His family thought he was safely working on an advanced alien station with regular communication schedules. They had no idea he was now the sole inhabitant of a massive piece of technology that most of the galaxy considered too dangerous to inhabit. The irony was not lost on him. The Zephyrians had abandoned their perfect station because they thought human modifications made it unstable. In reality, Jake's modifications were probably the only reason the station was still functioning properly. Their beautiful crystalline technology worked wonderfully under ideal conditions, but space was not ideal. Space was harsh and unpredictable, and full of problems that required creative solutions rather than mathematical perfection. Jake finished his meal and began planning his next day's work. Tomorrow he would attempt to align the communication array and send a distress signal. If that failed, he would start investigating the maintenance pods to see if any of them could be modified for long-range flight. If that also failed, he would have to accept that he might be living on Kepler Station for a very long time. The thought should have terrified him, but instead Jake felt something unexpected stirring in his chest. It was not fear or despair. It was excitement. For 3 years he had been the junior partner on this station, constantly having his suggestions dismissed and his repairs treated as temporary fixes. Now he had the chance to show what human engineering could really accomplish. The Zephyrians had given up on their perfect station, but Jake Morrison was just getting started. Jake woke up after his first night alone on Kepler Station, feeling more rested than he had in months. Without the constant background noise of Zephyrian musical conversations and the stress of having his work criticized, he had slept deeply for the first time since arriving at the station. He ate a quick breakfast of processed protein bars and headed to the communication array to begin his first major project. The transmitter alignment took most of the morning. Jake had to run between 3 different control stations, making precise adjustments while watching timing displays that counted down in Zephyrian mathematical symbols. The first 2 attempts failed when he missed the coordination windows by a few seconds. The third attempt looked promising until a power fluctuation threw off the calibration at the last moment. Instead of getting frustrated, Jake stopped to analyze the problem. The power fluctuation was minor, barely noticeable in normal operations, but it was enough to disrupt the sensitive timing required for long-range communication. The Zephyrians had built the system assuming their power grid would maintain perfect stability. They had not included any compensation for the small variations that occurred in real-world conditions. Jake spent the afternoon designing a simple modification to the communication system. He installed power buffers at each control station that would maintain stable voltage during the alignment procedure. It was not elegant like Zephyrian technology, but it worked. His 4th attempt at signal alignment succeeded perfectly, and soon he was broadcasting a distress signal toward the nearest inhabited system. The message was simple and direct. Jake identified himself, explained that he was alone on Kepler Station due to an emergency evacuation, and requested assistance or communication with human authorities. He set the message to repeat every hour and hoped that someone would eventually hear it and respond. With communication established, Jake turned his attention to more ambitious projects. Living alone on the station had given him the freedom to really examine how everything worked without Zephyrian supervisors constantly looking over his shoulder. What he discovered was both impressive and frustrating. The Zephyrians had indeed built beautiful technology. Their crystalline components were works of art that functioned with mathematical precision. Their control systems were elegant and efficient. Their power distribution network was a masterpiece of engineering that could handle enormous loads with minimal waste. But everything was designed for perfection, not practicality. Jake started in the power generation section, where he had spent most of his time during the past 3 years. The main reactor was a fusion plant that used Zephyrian crystal matrices to contain and control the reaction. It worked flawlessly as long as nothing went wrong, but there were no backup systems, no redundant components, and no margin for error. One failure in any critical component would shut down the entire station. Human engineering philosophy was different. Humans built systems that could fail safely and still continue operating. They used redundant components, backup systems, and safety margins that allowed for unexpected problems. Jake began applying these principles to the Zephyrian technology. He started by installing backup power routing that would automatically switch to alternate pathways if any primary conduit failed. The parts came from storage areas throughout the station, components that the Zephyrians had installed but never connected because their perfect system was not supposed to need backups. Jake spent days crawling through maintenance tunnels, running new cables and installing switching relays that would kick in during emergencies. The atmosphere processing system got similar treatment. Jake added redundant pumps, backup filters, and emergency storage tanks that would keep the air breathable, even if major components failed. He used equipment from the abandoned Zephyrian quarters, repurposing their personal air purifiers and humidity controllers into station-wide safety systems. Food production was his next challenge. The station had been designed to receive regular supply shipments, not to support long-term habitation. Jake found the hydroponics bay that the Zephyrians had built but never used. They preferred their crystalline nutrients and had installed the growing systems only to meet human requirements during joint operations. Jake studied the growing manuals and began converting empty storage areas into expanded agricultural space. He used lighting panels from abandoned sections, water recycling pumps from unused laboratories, and climate control systems from the Zephyrian meditation chambers. Within 2 weeks, he had tripled the growing capacity and planted seeds from the Sci emergency supplies that would provide fresh food in a few months. The most ambitious project was structural reinforcement. Jake had noticed that the station's framework relied heavily on magnetic field generators to maintain structural integrity. This was typical Zephyrian engineering, using energy fields instead of physical supports. It was elegant and space-efficient, but vulnerable to power failures or electromagnetic interference. Jake began installing physical support beams throughout the critical sections of the station. He used structural components from the outer ring sections that were no longer needed with the reduced crew. The work was dangerous and exhausting, requiring him to work in zero gravity outside the station's hull, but it was necessary. When his modifications were complete, Kepler Station would be able to maintain structural integrity even with complete power loss. Each project taught Jake more about the fundamental differences between human and Zephyrian engineering approaches. The aliens built for efficiency and elegance, creating systems that performed perfectly under ideal conditions. Humans built for reliability and adaptability, creating systems that continued working even when conditions were far from ideal. Jake documented everything he did in detailed video logs and technical reports. Partly this was professional habit from his engineering training, but partly it was because he suspected this would not be his only challenge. If other joint human-alien projects were using similar design philosophies, they might face similar problems. His experiences on Kepler Station could provide valuable lessons for future engineering efforts. The work was physically demanding but mentally satisfying. For the first time in his career, Jake had complete freedom to implement the solutions he knew were correct. There were no committee meetings, no cultural sensitivity reviews, no diplomatic considerations about alien preferences. There was just engineering in its purest form, solving problems with the best available methods. After 6 weeks of constant work, Jake had transformed Kepler Station into something fundamentally different from what the Zephyrians had built. It was no longer an elegant demonstration of crystalline perfection. Instead, it had become a robust, adaptable, human-influenced hybrid that combined the best aspects of both engineering philosophies. The power systems now had multiple redundant pathways and could automatically reroute around failures. The life support systems could maintain habitable conditions even with major component losses. The structural framework could withstand impacts, explosions, or power failures that would have destroyed the original design. The station was no longer beautiful in the Zephyrian sense, but it was incredibly strong and reliable. Jake stood in the central observation deck and looked out at the stars, feeling proud of what he had accomplished. The Zephyrians had abandoned their perfect station because they thought it was too dangerous to inhabit. Jake had proven that their perfect station could be made even better by applying human engineering principles that prioritized function over form. His communication system had been broadcasting distress signals for weeks without response, but Jake was no longer worried about rescue. He had food, air, water, and power for years. He had projects that could keep him busy for decades. Most importantly, he had proven to himself that human engineering was not inferior to alien technology. It was just different, and in many ways, better. Jake Morrison was no longer a stranded engineer waiting for rescue. He was a human who had taken alien perfection and made it stronger. Jake was working in the hydroponics bay when the first warning alarms began sounding throughout Kepler Station. After 2 months of silence except for minor maintenance alerts, the sudden noise made him drop his wrench and look around in confusion. The display panels were flashing amber warnings about incoming electromagnetic disturbance and elevated radiation levels. He ran to the command center and pulled up the sensor readings. A massive solar storm was approaching from the local star, much larger than anything in the recorded data. The wave of charged particles and electromagnetic energy would reach the station in less than 4 hours. Jake quickly accessed the storm protocols that the Zephyrians had programmed into the station's computer systems. According to the emergency procedures, a storm of this magnitude required complete evacuation of the station. All personnel were supposed to board escape vessels and retreat to a safe distance until the storm passed. The station itself was to be powered down to minimal levels and left to ride out the electromagnetic assault on automatic systems. Jake stared at the evacuation protocol and almost laughed. He had no escape vessels and nowhere to go even if he did. The Zephyrians had taken all the pods when they abandoned the station. His only choice was to stay aboard and hope that his modifications would be enough to keep the station operational through the storm. He pulled up the technical specifications for solar storm protection and immediately saw the problem. The original Zephyrian design assumed that any storm large enough to threaten the station would give enough advance warning for evacuation. They had built minimal shielding and no redundant systems for electromagnetic protection. Their elegant, crystalline technology was particularly vulnerable to the kind of energy surges that solar storms produced. Jake had 4 hours to prepare Kepler Station for an event that its designers had never intended it to survive. He started by shutting down all non-essential systems and routing power through the backup pathways he had installed. The redundant power distribution network that the Zephyrians had considered unnecessary suddenly became the most important system on the station. Next, he activated the physical structural supports he had added throughout the critical sections. During normal operations, these were backup systems that carried no load, but during the storm they would prevent structural failure if the magnetic field generators were disrupted. Jake also sealed all the emergency bulkheads and pressurized the backup air supplies he had installed. The most critical challenge was protecting the main computer systems. Zephyrian crystalline processors were incredibly fast and efficient, but they were also sensitive to electromagnetic interference. Jake had noticed this vulnerability during his repairs and had quietly installed additional shielding around the most important control systems. Now he activated electromagnetic barriers throughout the command center and engineering sections. With 2 hours remaining before storm arrival, Jake made his way to the main power core to implement his most ambitious modification. He had been working on this project for weeks but had never tested it under real conditions. The Zephyrian fusion reactor used crystalline containment fields that required precise electromagnetic control. During a solar storm, external interference could disrupt these fields and cause reactor shutdown or worse. Jake had designed a hybrid containment system that combined Zephyrian field technology with human mechanical backup systems. If the electromagnetic controls failed, physical containment barriers would automatically engage to maintain reactor stability. It was not as elegant as the pure crystalline approach, but it was much more reliable under adverse conditions. Installing the mechanical containment system required shutting down the reactor temporarily and working in a highly radioactive environment. Jake put on the heaviest radiation suit he could find and began the delicate process of integrating human engineering with alien technology. He had practiced the procedure dozens of times in simulation, but doing it for real with a solar storm, Approaching was terrifying. The work took 90 minutes of careful manipulation of components that could kill him instantly if mishandled. Jake's hands shook inside the radiation suit gloves as he connected the final mechanical linkages and ran test cycles on the hybrid system. Everything checked out perfectly. The reactor would now continue operating even if the storm disrupted its electromagnetic controls. With 30 minutes until storm arrival, Jake returned to the command center and strapped himself into the emergency chair he had installed. The original Zephyrian control stations were designed for their graceful floating posture, not for riding out violent electromagnetic storms. Jake had built a human-style command seat with full restraints and impact protection. The storm hit Kepler station like an invisible tsunami of energy. Jake watched the sensor readings climb off their normal scales as waves of charged particles and electromagnetic radiation washed over the station. The lights flickered and the artificial gravity fluctuated, but the backup power systems he had installed kept everything running. The first major test came when the electromagnetic pulse from the storm's leading edge struck the station. Jake watched the displays as several primary control circuits overloaded and shut down, but the backup systems immediately took over. The power distribution network automatically rerouted around the damaged sections, maintaining stable electricity throughout the station. 20 minutes into the storm, the structural stress readings began climbing toward dangerous levels. The magnetic field generators that normally helped support the station's framework were being interfered with by the external electromagnetic chaos. Jake felt the deck plates vibrating under his feet as the station's structure flexed and twisted. Then the physical support beams he had installed throughout the station began carrying the structural load. The vibration stopped, and the stress readings stabilized. Kepler Station was now being held together by human engineering principles instead of Zephyrian field technology, and it was working perfectly. The most critical moment came during the storm's peak intensity. A massive surge of electromagnetic energy overloaded the main computer core, despite Jake's additional shielding. Crystalline processors throughout the station shut down as their delicate quantum matrices were disrupted by interference. For several terrifying minutes, Jake lost control of most station systems, but the mechanical backup systems he had installed continued operating. Life support ran on simple electrical circuits that were immune to electromagnetic interference. The reactor remained stable under mechanical containment. The structural supports held firm. Kepler Station continued functioning even though its sophisticated computer brain had been temporarily knocked unconscious. Jake manually controlled the station's essential systems for 2 hours while the storm raged around them. He adjusted power levels by hand, monitored life support through analog gauges, and kept the reactor stable using mechanical controls that the Zephyrians had considered primitive. It was exhausting work that required constant attention, but it kept the station operational. When the storm finally passed and the electromagnetic interference faded, the crystalline computer systems gradually came back online. Jake watched in amazement as the displays lit up one by one, showing that every critical system had survived intact. The station had not only endured the solar storm, but had continued full operations throughout the entire event. The Zephyrian evacuation protocols had assumed that a storm of this magnitude would destroy any station that attempted to ride it out. According to their projections, Kepler Station should have been a lifeless hulk drifting in space with all systems destroyed. Instead, it had emerged from the storm stronger and more stable than before. Jake spent the next several hours running complete diagnostics on every system aboard the station. Some of the more delicate Zephyrian components had been damaged and would need replacement, but all the critical functions were working perfectly. The hybrid human-alien engineering approach had proven itself under the most extreme conditions possible. More importantly, Jake realized that his modifications had fundamentally changed the character of Kepler Station. It was no longer a fragile demonstration of crystalline perfection that required ideal conditions to function. It had become a robust, adaptable platform that could handle whatever the universe threw at it. As he sat in the command center watching the post-storm status reports, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Zephyrians had abandoned their station because they believed it could not handle unexpected challenges. Jake had proven that their beautiful technology could be made strong enough to survive anything, when combined with human engineering principles that planned for the unexpected. The storm had been the ultimate test of his work, and Kepler Station had passed with distinction. Jake Morrison was no longer just surviving on an abandoned alien station. He was running a superior hybrid facility that represented the best of both human and Zephyrian engineering capabilities. Jake was replacing damaged crystalline components in the communication array when his long-range sensors detected incoming ships. After 3 months of solitude, the sudden appearance of multiple vessels on the edge of sensor range made his heart race. He dropped his tools and rushed to the command center to get a better look at the approaching fleet. The sensor display showed 5 ships moving toward Kepler Station in a standard investigation formation. Jake recognized the energy signatures immediately. 3 were Zephyrian vessels, their crystalline hulls glowing with the characteristic blue light of their propulsion systems. The other 2 were human ships, probably from the Galactic Trade Consortium's inspection division. Jake activated his communication system and sent a greeting message to the incoming fleet. "This is Engineer Jake Morrison aboard Kepler Station. Station is fully operational and ready to receive visitors. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions." The response came from one of the human ships. "This is Captain Helen Brooks of the Trade Consortium vessel New Horizon. We received your distress signal 3 weeks ago and have come to investigate the reported emergency evacuation of Kepler Station. Are you injured and in need of immediate medical assistance?" "Negative on medical assistance," Jake replied. I'm in good health and the station is operating normally. Request permission to provide full briefing on station status and recent improvements upon your arrival." There was a long pause before Captain Brooks responded. "Morrison, our records show that Kepler Station was evacuated due to imminent catastrophic system failure. How is it possible that you are still there and the station is operational?" Jake smiled as he looked around the command center with its hybrid human Zephyrian control systems. "That's a longer story than I can explain over the radio, Captain. I think you'll find the situation more interesting than our records indicated." The fleet took 6 hours to reach the station, giving Jake time to prepare for what he expected would be a thorough investigation. He gathered all his documentation, video logs, and technical reports into organized files. He also made sure that the most impressive examples of his engineering work were easily accessible for demonstration. When the inspection team docked at Kepler Station, Jake was waiting in the main airlock to greet them. Captain Brooks was a tall woman with graying hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades dealing with complex situations in space. Behind her came 2 human engineers, a trade consortium administrator, and 3 Zephyrians, including Veltar, the chief engineer who had been part of the original evacuation. "Engineer Morrison," Captain Brooks said as she stepped aboard the station. "I have to admit this is not what we expected to find. According to the reports we received, this station should be a dead hulk drifting in space." Jake gestured toward the gleaming corridors with their hybrid lighting systems and improved atmospheric controls. "As you can see, Captain, the reports of Kepler Station's death have been greatly exaggerated. Would you like the full tour, or should we start with the technical briefing?" Veltar stepped forward, his crystalline features reflecting confusion and what might have been embarrassment. "Morrison, the projection models clearly indicated catastrophic failure within days of our departure. How did you prevent the power core collapse?" "There was no power core collapse to prevent," Jake replied calmly. "The projection models were based on incorrect assumptions about the cause of the power fluctuations. The real problem was corroded connectors in the distribution network, which I had been fixing regularly for months. Once I implemented permanent solutions instead of temporary repairs, the power grid stabilized completely." One of the human engineers pulled out a scanner and began taking readings from the nearest control panel. "Sir, these power distribution readings are remarkable. The efficiency is nearly 30% higher than the original design specifications." Jake led the group through the station, explaining his modifications as they went. He showed them the redundant power pathways that had kept the lights on during the solar storm. He demonstrated the backup life support systems that could maintain atmosphere even with major component failures. He took them to the reinforced structural sections that had held the station together when electromagnetic interference disrupted the magnetic field generators. In the main engineering bay, Jake pulled up the recordings from the solar storm that had struck 2 weeks earlier. The inspection team watched in amazement as the displays showed Kepler Station maintaining full operations throughout an electromagnetic event that should have destroyed every system on board. "This is impossible," one of the Zephyrian engineers said. "No station can remain operational during a Class 7 solar storm. The electromagnetic interference alone should have shut down all crystalline processors." Jake smiled and activated one of his hybrid control systems. "You're right that pure crystalline technology can't handle that kind of interference. But crystalline technology backed up by mechanical systems can handle just about anything. I've combined the efficiency of your designs with the reliability of human engineering principles." Captain Brooks studied the storm data carefully. "Morrison, according to these readings, the station not only survived the storm but actually improved its operational efficiency during the event. How is that possible?" "The storm forced all the primary systems to switch over to the backup networks I installed," Jake explained. "The backup systems are actually more efficient than the originals because they use direct routing instead of the complex switching matrices that the Zephyrians prefer. When the storm passed and the primary systems came back online, they integrated with the backups to create a hybrid network that performs better than either system alone." The inspection continued for hours as Jake demonstrated improvement after improvement. The hydroponics bay that could feed a crew of 20 for years without resupply. The manufacturing facilities he had created using repurposed alien equipment. The communication array that could now reach 3 times farther than its original range. Every system on the station had been enhanced, reinforced, or completely redesigned. Veltar became increasingly agitated as the tour progressed. These modifications violate fundamental design principles. The aesthetic integration is completely destroyed. The mathematical elegance of the original systems has been compromised. "You're absolutely right," Jake agreed. "The station is no longer mathematically elegant or aesthetically perfect, but it's also no longer fragile or unreliable. Your beautiful design couldn't handle real-world conditions. My ugly modifications can handle anything the universe throws at them." Captain Brooks pulled Jake aside while the other engineers continued examining his work. "Morrison, I need to understand something. Why didn't you just wait for rescue? You had enough emergency supplies to last until we arrived. Instead, you spent 3 months completely rebuilding this station. Why?" Jake thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Captain, for 3 years I worked on this station, as a junior partner. Every suggestion I made was dismissed as primitive human thinking. Every repair I performed was treated as a temporary fix until proper Zephyrian components could be installed. I was never allowed to show what human engineering could really accomplish." He gestured toward the bustling engineering bay where human and Zephyrian technicians were working together to understand his modifications. "When I found myself alone here with complete freedom to work, I realized this was my chance to prove that human engineering isn't inferior to alien technology. It's just different. And in many ways, it's better." Captain Brooks nodded slowly. "Morrison, the Trade Consortium is going to want a full report on everything you've done here. These improvements could revolutionize how we design space installations. Would you be willing to remain on Kepler Station as chief engineer and oversee the integration of human engineering principles into our other facilities?" Jake looked around at the station he had transformed from an abandoned alien relic into a thriving example of hybrid technology. "Captain, I can't think of anything I'd rather do, but I have one condition." "What's that?" "Any future projects need to include human engineers as equal partners from the beginning, not as junior technicians brought in to maintain alien equipment. The best results come from combining different approaches, not from having one species trying to copy another." Captain Brooks smiled and extended her hand. "Engineer Morrison, I think we can arrange that. Welcome to your new position as Chief Engineer of Hybrid Technologies for the Galactic Trade Consortium." As Jake shook her hand, he could see Veltar and the other Zephyrians examining his work with what looked like genuine respect rather than condescension. They were beginning to understand that mathematical perfection and practical reliability were both valuable, and that the best engineering came from combining the strengths of different approaches. Jake Morrison had been abandoned on a dying station, by aliens who thought human engineering was primitive and unreliable. He had transformed that station into something stronger and more capable than anything either species could have built alone. Most importantly, he had proven that being different didn't mean being inferior. The abandoned human engineer had rebuilt their station stronger than before,